Okay, I'm here. I'm back with Scott Ritter again. We had a great conversation last time. We're looking to do the same here. Scott, I wanted to start with what I think is a really pressing matter, and that's that the Ukrainians are continuing to hit I believe it's pronounced Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and I believe eastern Ukraine. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple aspects to this. One, let's just start with the absurdity of the Ukrainians attacking this facility. They're not ignorant of what this facility is. They're knowledgeable of the dangers that are accrued in carrying out this attack. Yet they're continuing to attack. Um, in conjunction with this is the absurdity of the world buying into a Ukrainian-based narrative that Russia is carrying out these attacks. The absolute illogic of Russia attacking a facility occupied by Russians seems to escape, the journalist class. But since mainstream media in the West seems to have subordinated itself to Ukrainian propagandists, maybe we shouldn't be so surprised by that. The other things that emerge from this is the role played by the United States, and I think this is an underappreciated aspect to the story. The initial attack against this facility took place on August 5th, but it was preceded by an August 1st presentation made by its Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in which he highlighted this facility and he began to create the mythology of Russian irresponsibility, talking about how Russia had turned this facility into a nuclear shield and that Russia was using this facility as a base to carry out attacks against the Ukrainians, knowing that the Ukrainians would never strike back, et cetera. No evidence was provided to sustain this, but what Blinken did is create the beginning of this narrative that says that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the territory around it must be removed from Russian control and turned over to international control, which would lead to the Ukrainians taking control. This is what the whole thing is about. So we know that the United States played a role in helping shape this narrative, which was then acted on by a Ukrainian attack. Now, the initial attacks appear to have been done by munitions that are under the control of the Ukrainian army exclusively. But the most recent attack appears to have been undertaken by a HIMARS rocket. And what's important about this is that as the deputy head of Ukrainian intelligence for the Kiev district, and the reason why that's important is the Kiev district, of course, is the region that interfaces most directly with the United States and NATO in terms of intelligence provision and command and control support, et cetera, said that nothing happens with the HIMARS unless it's directed to by the United States. So if a HIMARS was fired by Ukrainians against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that means it was done not only with permission and approval of the United States, but the active participation, since the United States provides the targeting intelligence that's used to support HIMARS operations. This means the United States is by proxy attacking Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is a war crime. It's a war crime of the highest order. And I don't understand why the US government's getting a free pass on this, why the media is being quiet about this. But now we come up with the final thing. Russia, I liken to you. I'm sure people are familiar with that old meme about the honey badger. Honey badger don't give a damn. I think they use another word, but it's I'll respect your interview, and I won't use it. But that's Russia right now. They're the honey badger. They don't give a damn. They could care less. I mean, they're going to play this game. They diplomatically they've taken it to the Security Council, and they're calling the bluff. They're saying, let's bring inspectors in. Ukraine doesn't want to bring inspectors in because inspectors will stumble across the truth, and the truth won't be convenient to the narrative being put forward by the Ukrainians. Right now, we have the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the G7, and everybody crying for not just the demilitarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but the creation of this international controlled zone where the Russians would relinquish control. I think Russia right now is indicating that it might be willing to demilitarize, but it certainly isn't going to relinquish control. This is a case of Ukraine trying to accomplish through diplomatic means and a false narrative that which it can't accomplish militarily. That is to push the Russians back in the Kherson region. But I also make the following prediction. The scope and scale of the Russian victory over Ukraine is going to increase in the coming days, weeks. And it's going to be of such magnitude that the issue of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant simply won't matter because the Ukrainians are going to be defeated in order. I think it's not too, in the not too distant future, Ukrainian forces are going to be pushed so far back in that area that no weapon they possess could ever again threaten the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So again, honey badger don't give a damn because the honey badgers win.
Yeah, we've been seeing for days now that Ukrainian losses are pretty massive. I mean, hundreds a day. I saw the other day something like 500 troops lost, and tanks and vehicles, very very high. How much longer can the Ukrainians hold out? Until they fully collapse. The armed forces, that is.
Well, I mean, we get a clue of this. Let's say the Ukrainians started the conflict with active duty force of around 260,000 men. They had available reserves around 300,000. They could mobilize and bring in another 600,000. A document that was leaked from the Ministry of Defense shows that by early July, the Ukrainians had suffered 191,000 casualties in the army alone. If you add in border guards, Air Force, et cetera, that number rises to around 250,000.
Wow.
That's an unsustainable loss. And this doesn't include the massive casualties that have accrued since that report was written, which probably number in the area of another 25,000. So, we're approaching 300,000 losses for Ukraine. Not all are dead. Most of these are wounded, but of this, I would say that around 80,000 represent dead, Ukrainian dead. And most of the wounded are wounded to such that they can't return to active duty. These are unsustainable losses. Ukraine cannot sustain these losses. The cream of their fighting force has been killed, wounded, and what's left has to be dispersed amongst untrained soldiers to such an extent that the combat effectiveness of the units that are created through this merger is as close to nil as possible. The Ukrainians right now are able to maintain a semblance of a defense because they are still operating within the fortified region of Donbass. But the Russians are in the process of rolling up the last of these fortifications. And once they break free of these fortifications, the Russians are going to actually enter into a phase of operations that plays to their doctrinal strength. And that is the maneuver warfare of the operational maneuver group or brigade. The Ukrainians may have been able to, fight the Russians on an equal plane early on in the conflict when their military was intact and staffed by professional soldiers. But right now, their military is incapable of engaging in that kind of combined arms maneuver warfare. And this will just, again, further the destruction and the rout of the Ukrainian military. So I think we've reached the culminating point, meaning that the Ukrainians will only get weaker. And the more this war goes on, it's not, that it's not a gradual weakening. All of the factors combine, and eventually you hit this tipping point where it's just a rapid collapse. We saw that with the French army in June of 1940 and the Battle of France, when the Germans, basically caused a very powerful, very well-equipped, well-trained French army to collapse. And I think we're going to see that now with the Ukrainians in the near future.
We saw recently, earlier this week, we saw Zelensky, is reportedly hiding in a bunker, and we saw high-ranking Ukrainian officials being evacuated from government buildings. Do you think this is a sign that they know that collapse is imminent?
No, I think the story, at least I saw, that relates to the evacuation, related to the aftermath of the explosion at the at a Russian air base in Crimea, and there was fear amongst Ukrainian leadership that the Russians would blame Ukraine for the attack, even though it appears that it was more of a matter of Russians violating their own safety protocols and having ammunition blow up, lighting off fuel and everything. Is just giant, massive, disastrous accident. But the Ukrainians believe the Russians might believe that they were involved, and therefore, and Russia has promised that any attack against Crimea will result in, the leadership targets in Ukraine being wiped out. And so I think they were running for their lives because they thought the Russians were coming after them. I do think that, independent of this evacuation to bunkers, I think there's enough data out there about the ongoing strains between the Office of the Presidency, Zelensky, and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense over the conduct of the war. The Ministry of Defense feels that the Office of the Presidency has intervened irresponsibly in order to shape perceptions that are favorable to the provision of international aid, military aid and monetary aid, but at the detriment of the Ukrainian armed forces. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have lost their lives in futile attacks and a pointless defense. I mean, the Ukrainian army on many occasions has said, we need to withdraw our troops from this village or else they'll be surrounded and destroyed. And the Office of the President has said, no, you hold on because we don't want to create the perception of retreat. And so thousands of soldiers lost their lives. At some point in time, the magnitude of this collapse, of this defeat, of these casualties is going to weigh on the minds of Ukrainian generals sufficiently to compel them to intervene. And I believe that Zelensky's days are numbered. I think he will either be asked to leave the country or he'll be given what I call the 75-cent solution, which is the price of one 9mm bullet in the back of his skull. But either way, Zelensky, I don't believe is long for the presidency. I think his days are numbered, and that the people that will remove him are not the Russian military, but the Ukrainian military.
Yeah, Dmitry Medvedev, I believe today, said that he was talking about Zelensky, and he said that he thinks Zelensky will either be court-martialed or he'll, flee possibly to the United States. What do you think's most likely there?
I think that depends on Zelensky himself. Has he bought into the mythology of Zelensky? Does he actually believe that he is Winston Churchill, the modern manifestation of Winston Churchill? Does he view himself as a modern-day King Leonidas? If that's the case, then he's not going to gracefully exit, and I think he'll be killed. Or is he Zelensky, the comedian, the actor who has grown addicted to a certain lifestyle and very much wants to go back to living that lifestyle, knowing that he has a great fortune sequestered away outside of Ukraine, inclusive of, allegedly a $35 million mansion in Miami. That may become very attractive to him as an alternative to being tied up, shot in a courtyard somewhere in Kiev. The choice is Zelensky's. I think, given what we know of the man, that he will choose life and he will run. I think that's what will happen.
Yeah. Medvedev talks about court martials. Who would be doing these court martials, right? Who would be doing these trials? Same with the Azov fighters and the other extremists that they're not, or that the Russians have captured. Who carries out that trial? Is it the Russians or?
I think when Medvedev spoke, he spoke that Zelensky might be tried by the Ukrainian military, not by the Russians. But I'd have to double check what he said. I don't want to be impugning something to him that he didn't say. When it comes to the Azov personnel and other people captured during the Battle of Mariupol and the liberation of the Donbass, any crimes that were committed on the territory of Donetsk People's Republic will be prosecuted by the Donetsk People's Republic. That's why you see in Mariupol that they are building a place for a trial. They've built these giant cages where they're going to put the defendants, and then they're building a courtroom where they'll be put on trial. And this trial will be done for the public. This trial is for the world. This trial will be devastating for Ukraine. This trial may be the straw that breaks the back of Zelensky, because Zelensky has been trying to convince the world that he is somehow this great defender of democracy civil liberties, human rights, etc. Instead, he's going to be exposed as the president who oversaw the operations of some of the most horrific people in modern history, the Azov regiment. Not only have the Russians and the Donetsk People's Republic captured, many of these people, they captured supporting documentation and video evidence in the form of cell phones, thumb drives, etc., that have on them images, photographs, and videos of these horrific crimes: the rape of women, the rape of children, the murder of children, the murder of men. It's all documented. It's all there. They have the evidence and they have the perpetrator. So they're going to be able to bring these tattooed Nazis, put them on public display, and then recite the crimes they've committed, provide proof of these crimes, and ultimately get a confession from them. And this will be so overwhelmingly convincing that the West can't deny it, can't ignore it. And I think we're going to see Zelensky's star sink.
Yeah, I don't see how the West can try to hide that. Even with all their propaganda powers, you can't really hide that. I wanted to talk about the HIMARS strike that the Ukrainians carried out on the POW camp that many of these Azov fighters have been stationed in. There's been some interviews with some of the Azov fighters that survived, and they talk about how they wish their government was trying to get them out, and they want to see a prisoner exchange, but instead the Ukrainians are killing them. Why do you think that is? Do they not want that trial to come about?
There's no doubt that these people were killed because they are the worst of the worst. These are the guys who know everything. They have the names, the dates, where the bodies are buried. Their images are on the film that we've discussed, video we've discussed. And many of them have already begun to give confessions. And the Ukrainian intelligence isn't bad, so they're aware of what's being said by whom. And they using HIMARS, remember, it's accurate within 30 feet. So this wasn't a generalized strike. This was a specific strike against a specific wing of the facility designed to kill specific people, the worst of the worst. The people that would do the most damage politically, not only to Ukraine, but to the United States, to NATO, to everybody who supported Zelensky and the Ukrainians. And the use of HIMARS, again, is just proof positive that the United States was behind this attack, that the United States understands the ramifications of having these horrific individuals go on trial in a process that isn't going to be speculative. It's not going to be he said, she said. It's going to be overwhelming documentary evidence, inclusive of videotapes showing the crimes being committed by the people on the docket. And so, again, as I said with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, HIMARS does not get targeted unless the United States is involved in the targeting. And so this means that the United States helped pick not only the general facility, but the specific part of the facility. They provide the targeting data, and they provided the operational intelligence necessary for the HIMARS to be brought into play, be fired, and be withdrawn to avoid Russian detection. And I'll just be blunt about this. This means that every American involved is a war criminal. A war crime. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. There literally is no debate here. You targeted prisoners of war. There is no legitimate military necessity for this. So any American involved in this, from the highest levels down to the corporal or lance corporal sitting there at the screen providing the targeting data, they are war criminals. And I'm just shocked that an American judge advocate who clearly they exist on the various staffs that are involved in this allowed this to occur. This is incomprehensible, and it's shocking. And the American public should be outraged that the United States government played an active role in facilitating a Ukrainian strike against Ukrainian prisoners of war for the sole purpose of silencing them in a criminal trial where their guilt is without debate.
Well, they're trying to blame it on Russia. They're saying Russia struck their own camp.
Yeah, just like Russia struck the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I mean, again, anybody who parrots this, repeats this, thinks this, you're only displaying your own ignorance. The forensic evidence alone dictates that the Ukrainians did it. I think the Ukrainians said that just so the United States can say, well, we don't know who did it. It's a he said, she said thing. No, it's not. It's not. The United States knows exactly who did it because we have the intelligence. Plus, we were involved in the targeting. Again, that's another aspect of a crime. When you commit a crime and then seek to cover up the crime, that's a crime. So there's just more that piles on. And now other Americans who may not have been involved in initial targeting, but now are involved in covering up the crime, become co-conspirators in the crime, and the circle widens. This is not a good thing for the United States. We're supposed to be a nation that embraces the law of war, the rule of law. We're supposed to be a nation that rises above this kind of criminal activity. But it appears that we're just down in the mud with the Ukrainians. We're no better than the Nazis who control the Ukrainian military at this point in time.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to you keep mentioning that every time there's a HIMARS strike, it's being carried out essentially by the Americans. The arms are being supplied by the Americans and the targeting data and everything. And if you look at the map of the region that'll be most affected if there were to be a breach of the reactor at the nuclear power plant, it would mostly affect, the eastern regions of Ukraine, which are Russian speaking. It would affect the Russian border area with Ukraine and the surrounding nations, which, have a predominantly Russian population. And, that appears to me that, the Americans are purposely trying to pollute as much of Russia with nuclear radiation as they can. Would you agree that's possibly an objective of theirs?
Well, I don't think it's an objective. And the reason why I say I don't think it's an objective is that as much as the media's played up the possibility of a new Chernobyl, Zaporizhzhia, the fact remains that the way these nuclear reactors were constructed makes them virtually impervious to the kind of attacks that are being carried out. HIMARS isn't going to penetrate the reinforced concrete dome and protective vessel for these reactors. The real danger comes by striking power supplies and things of that nature, the safety mechanisms that keep these reactors operating. If you knock out the power supply, now you've replicated, for instance, the events that began Chernobyl. Chernobyl started as a training exercise to simulate what would happen if power was lost to the Chernobyl reactor. Would the backup power plant kick in time? And then that went bad, but then they had their failsafe, which hit the famous red button, and you would scram it, and it would be disastrous for the reactor in terms of its ongoing operations as a provider of electricity. But from a safety perspective, you've nullified it. What went wrong there was the design of the reactor was such that when they hit the red button, it actually was conducive to creating an explosion as opposed to shutting it down. Those conditions don't exist with these. So even if they cut off power, and even if you started to have an emergency problem, each one of these reactors, first of all, only two of them are in operation right now, and they're in operation at 50%. You just hit the magic red button, and they will shut down. There's literally no chance of a Chernobyl type event. So I don't like to go down that route. But having said that, I also would say that there's no chance of me setting off an ammunition dump by flicking matches at it. Doesn't make it a good idea to flick a match at it just in case something went wrong and it blew up. So, I would say the likelihood of an artillery strike against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant setting off a Chernobyl type event is very, very, very slim. But it's not a good idea to tempt fate. This is still one of the dumbest things in the world, and it's a crime because, ask any prosecutor in the United States, attempted murder. Does in order to be charged with attempted murder, do you need to have a 100% chance of success had you carried out, or any percentage? What percentage do they draw the line? Oh, if you only had a 20% chance of actually killing the person, can we charge you with attempted murder? Yes. If you only had a 1% chance, can we charge you with attempted murder? Yes. The United States can be charged with attempted genocide. The United States should be charged with attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction to destroy humanity. Um, this is a reality. It's a statement of fact. These charges should be brought. No one's going to bring them. Only we can bring them ourselves, but we should do it as well. Literally, the President of the United States should order General Miley to send in military police and arrest everybody involved in this and put them on trial, because the reputation of our nation is at stake here. The reputation of you, of me, of every man and woman on the streets today is on the line. And to remain silent as our government is complicit in what could be one of the greatest acts of mass murder in modern history, if in case one of these reactors did go off. It's just stunning that the American media and the American citizens seem to be okay with this.
Well, many of the American citizens, I would argue, have no idea really what's going on. They don't trust the media, the mainstream media. They don't follow them, and they don't know who to believe. And that's why people like you are so important, right? And that's why they attack you, and they have you on that blacklist, right? Who was it? Newsweek published the Ukrainian government's blacklist.
Well, just a news flash for you. I challenged that. I don't know if you know, I wrote a letter to Chuck Schumer and Gillibrand and Paul Tonko, and I let it be known through various interviews, including a local one that was played here that Schumer saw, that if they don't shut this thing down, I will be seeking a federal injunction to shut it down. And that would be very bad for them, because I would probably win, because this is definitely a First Amendment issue. They shut it down. The Ukrainian Center for Disinformation has withdrawn the list. They no longer are publishing the list, and it's no longer out there. So that is score one victory for the good guys here.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to, how do you think Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin and Medvedev and Sergei Lavrov, how do you think they view the American people, the regular people of America?
Well, I mean, as human beings,
Right.
as fellow human beings, as good people, especially Lavrov. He's dealt with Americans his entire life. He knows the American people. He knows America. He knows that America has the potential of being one of the greatest nations in the world, that we stand for. We have good ideals, good values. Putin respects America, respects the accomplishments of the United States. So does Dmitry Medvedev. I think they're disgusted with the current leadership of the United States. They are very disappointed in the Congress of the United States. And as such, they are dismayed with the American public at large for electing a Congress such as the one that we have. It's disappointing for Russia to see American democracy floundering in the way that it is. We're supposed to be better than this. I think that they view America as a nation that has significant problems: racism, unemployment, poverty, hate crimes, gun violence, a bad medical system. But that doesn't reflect on their attitude towards the American people. I think there's great love between Russia and the American people. I don't think you will find in Russia people who say, I hate Americans. I think you'll find a lot of people that say, I'm disappointed in Americans. And you'll find a whole bunch of people who say that I don't like the American government. I don't like the way America interfaces with the rest of the world. But when it comes down to the individual Americans, I think there's a lot of love, a lot of respect, a lot of shared humanity. I think the Russians, more so than their American counterparts, bequeath to the Americans the reality of humanity, meaning they recognize Americans as being mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, uncles, aunts, people capable of love, capable of emotion, people capable of desire, human beings. You won't get that reaction from Americans. We tend to oversimplify Russians. We tend to say, oh, the Russians are, they're slaves to autocracy. The Russians are this, the Russians are that. But the last thing we do is say the Russians are people. I mean, why else would we support economic sanctions that were designed to inflict horrific economic harm on the Russian people. Normally, when we impose sanctions against a nation, the sanctions are designed to target a certain class, the ruling class, etc. We try to avoid something that brings undue harm to the innocent people. But this most recent round of sanctions is designed to collapse the Russian economy in a manner that engenders horrific harm on the Russian people to the extent that they would rise up and remove Vladimir Putin from power. That means that the American people are okay with hurting the Russian people. And I think this has it reflects bad on America. And I think, when the Russian people think about it, it lowers their opinions of Americans. I mean, what kind of people wish harm on other people? I mean, it's again, nations can have their differences, governments can have their differences. Even if those differences turn into war, war is war. People understand that. But this was a deliberate economic act designed to bring life-ending harm to the average Russian. And I don't think the Russians are too okay with that.
Yeah. I saw a funny tweet the other day. It was a picture on top. It was Joe Biden, and it had a quote. It said, "I will crush Russia and its people." And on the bottom, it was a picture of Napoleon and Hitler, and it just said, "Good luck with that." Right? Like, not very easy to do. I wanted to touch on something. The last couple of weeks, I was born in 2001 to lead off. So I'm very young, and my whole life I've never really felt like there's been a real risk of nuclear war. Like I've never felt a threat from that. But the last couple of weeks, that's completely changed, especially with Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. The night before she went, I went to sleep, and I was laying in bed, and I thought, this is the closest I've ever come to, going to sleep for the last time. You know what I mean? And I was very worried about that. You grew up in the Cold War. You grew up in Europe, and I've heard you talk about what it was like living in Europe, knowing that, at any time nuclear war could break out. I want to know, do you have any, tips on how to manage, with the anxiety or stress of possible nuclear war at any point?
Well, I mean, look, there was a book back in the 1960s called Alas, Babylon. And that the premise of the book was Alas, Babylon was the code word that a husband would use in a phone call to his wife saying the nuclear war has started. And it meant, get the kids and try and seek shelter. The world is coming to an end. Even though that was a novel, and it might have even been made into a movie, I'm not certain. My father was active duty Air Force, and he had a similar code with my mom. That's the life we lived. That every day my dad would go to work, we lived knowing that the phone could ring and he would issue the code words, which meant the world is about to end. Do what you can to save yourselves. We didn't really have a big plan. I think it was to throw water, the dogs, and everybody into a car and drive. At the time, we lived at Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, which would, of course, been one of the main targets in a nuclear conflict. And basically, you just that's it. But I was a young kid then. I think the more terror was on the part of my mom because here she is, a mother with a young family. And when you start, I mean, I can say this as a father. When you start a family, you're looking to the future. You don't start a family if you believe the world is going to come to an end. You don't want to bring children into such a world. You bring children into a world that's supposed to be filled with hope and potential, etc. When I lived in Germany, I was older. I was a junior, senior in high school, and this was tougher because now I'm of the age where I can say that I was knowledgeable of the reality of death and what the consequences would be, and it was sort of disconcerting to live next door to what's called the North Point Weapons Storage Facility, where American nuclear weapons were stored, knowing that was going to be one of the first places hit if the balloon went up. The Russians, the Soviets would be hitting that probably with a nuclear weapon. And that meant it's over, you're dead, and you'll never know it. And my dad would oftentimes, because of the crises that were taking place, be called away to go to the bunker at Simbach Air Force Base down in the bunker, designed to withstand nuclear, biological, chemical attack. And in the bunker back then, you couldn't give the code word. He just disappeared. He was gone. There was no calling the family, checking in, just gone. And we knew that when that happened, this would happen without warning. He just wouldn't come home. And then the wives would all call around and they figured out something had happened. And now, you're a kid and your dad's in the nuclear bunker because there's the potential of a nuclear conflict. And you're getting on the bus in the morning to go to school. Where I lived, I was about 40 miles, 50 miles away from the high school. We had to be bussed in. And you're just wondering, am I ever going to see my home again? If I'm ever going to see my mom again? If I'm ever going to see my dogs, my cats? And then you go to high school and you're trying to what? Study, play football, ask a girl out on a date while all this is happening. And the answer is yes. That's what you did. You studied, you played football, you tried to ask a girl out on a date, probably said no, but you did what normal teenagers do because that was the life. But it was always in the back of your mind, that this was a real potential. I can't speak to people who lived here in the United States, what they went through. I think most Americans by that time weren't living their daily lives in fear. I think if you lived near a nuclear missile silo, if your family was in the military, maybe that might have a different opinion. But I think the average kid, my peer group growing up in the United States, wasn't cowering under the desks, wasn't worried about nuclear attack. But I can tell you that it was a real threat. In the 1980s, the world almost came to an end several times because of inadvertent accidents, because of a misinterpretation of intelligence, etc. Both sides mobilized their nuclear forces and were prepared to launch strikes. This is why, for instance, the INF Treaty was so important to me. Not only was I a key participant in it, but for the first time, we started removing the very weapons that threatened me as a child. The weapons that were going to come down and rain death and destruction, I got to play a role in eliminating them. And it felt really good to free up an entire generation of European children and American kids from the constant threat of a nuclear annihilation. It felt really good. It feels really bad today to be witness to history repeating itself as we put back into place everything we got rid of, as if we never learned the lesson of history. I don't think Americans understand how close they are to dying. I mean, you got it. You understood. You knew that Nancy Pelosi's visit could have set in motion a military-on-military conflict that spiraled out of control, resulting in the Chinese sinking the American fleet and the Americans nuking China in retaliation, and then China taking out an American city in retaliation, and next you know, general nuclear strike. And it's game over for everybody. You recognize that. I don't know if your peer group recognizes that. I know my peer group doesn't. I know that all the people that I associate with in civilian life aren't living their lives worried about that, but it is a real risk. Not so much in Europe, because I do think that NATO understands the consequences of trying to confront Russia directly in Ukraine. I do think Russia knows, I don't think Russia ever intended to expand this conflict beyond Ukraine, but they understand what Article 5 of the NATO Charter is, and they're not going to tempt fate by attacking a NATO country. The problem is China. And when I say China, I don't mean China's the problem. I mean, we're the problem with China, because we don't have the military capacity to defeat China if China were to invade Taiwan. All we could do is the symbolic sailing of the fleet. And it's not just me saying this. I mean, every war game that's been played out in the last couple of decades about a potential Chinese-American conflict over Taiwan results in a Chinese victory. But you don't have to take my word for it. People say, well, no, come on, the Navy's got to be smarter than this. They're not, they didn't put all that money in the ships just to have them sunk. Yes, they did. It's called a legacy program. The Navy is married to the concept of aircraft carriers. They're in love with aircraft carriers. Their whole existence revolves around aircraft carriers and big boomer submarines with missiles on them. But that's what the Navy lives for. General Berger, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, when he came in, reviewed the war plans, reviewed the obligations that the Marine Corps has in accordance with the National Security Strategy, in the National Defense Strategy. And he put out a paper that said, we cannot live up to our obligations under these strategies because as we are currently configured, we can't do this job. And I have a duty and responsibility to make sure the Marine Corps can do its job. The past generations of Marines have been married to legacy programs that revolve around putting thousands of Marines on big ships and sailing them to hostile shores. And he said, you do that today, we will all die. They will kill every one of us. They'll sink the ship, we lose everything. He said, we have to rethink how we approach war in the day of accurate long-range ballistic missiles that can defeat any air defense system the Navy can put up. But the Navy hasn't done this. The Navy still feels that it can sail ships next to Taiwan and get away with it. It can't. They won't. And if China sinks them and we suffer enough casualties, there will be tremendous pressure placed on the President of the United States to carry out a nuclear retaliation.
By who?
Or, say again?
Who would that pressure be put on? Who would be putting that pressure on him?
Every American citizen, every member of Congress, every member of the Department of Defense, everybody. Nobody's going to sit idly and let 15,000 Americans die like that and not strike back. That's just human nature.
Do you really think people would go straight to a nuclear strike, though? Because I mean,
that's all we have. We have no other.
Game.
We got nothing else.
Yeah.
What do we got? The fleet? No, we just lost the fleet. It doesn't exist anymore. When to bring in another fleet, Daniels will sink that one too. The only thing we have is a W-76-2 low-yield nuclear warhead fired on a Trident missile from an Ohio-class submarine.
Yeah. And then the Chinese respond by
taking out Los Angeles, taking out Guam. Denver, taking out Seattle, taking out Guam. Yeah.
Japan, Okinawa. How do we avoid that? You have a book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. I wanted to talk about that a bit and how that could provide insight on how we could, like you said, what we did with the INF Treaty, how we could do that again.
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing it up. I'm very proud of this book. It's a book not only about history. I mean, it tells a history of something that's never been told before about how the INF Treaty was not just conceived, but how it was implemented and the obstacles that existed that were overcome. And it's a very human story about the people that were involved in it. But, you know, George Santayana, American philosopher, has a statement that people sort of take and use. Those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. But when you hear condemned to repeat it, that means that they're talking about the lessons of failure. The INF is one of those history lessons that shows success. And when people say, well, you can't talk about what happened with the INF Treaty and today, they're not the same. Really, what if I said the following? I said, what if we had a situation where Russia invaded its neighbor and got embroiled in a war where the United States responded by providing weapons and assistance to the fighters fighting Russia, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Russians. So a proxy conflict where the Russian invasion caused disarmament agreements to collapse, no more meaningful disarmament engagement, freeze in relations, where the United States was engaged in economic sanctions designed to curtail Russian exportation of energy for the purpose of destroying the Russian economy. And I could go on and on. Wouldn't you say that that's sort of exactly what's happening today?
Yes.
That's what was happening in 1985, 1986. Exactly what was happening in 1985. The neighbor they invaded was Afghanistan. And a lot of people, you know, may not remember or know or be knowledgeable of Operation Cyclone and subsequent CIA operations to flood Afghanistan with millions of dollars of weaponry, including Stinger missiles, which were used to great effect against Soviet aircraft and helicopters, killing thousands of Russians. You know, we were sanctioning the Russian gas. So we actually, the CIA pulled a stunt where we replaced some of the meters that are used to monitor pressure and safety devices on Soviet gas pipelines, and we replaced them with ones that were deliberately defective that allowed the pressure to rise up without being detected and created an explosion, blowing up a pipeline. So, you know, we were actively destroying Russian infrastructure. And, you know, President Carter in 1979 had just begun the process of implementing what's called the SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 2, the second variation. But those talks were frozen because Russia, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And then we saw the collapse of the INF talks in 82. So it was a desperate situation where we had, for instance, an exercise, Able Archer 83, that the Russians or the Soviets were looking at it saying, this isn't an exercise. They're actually getting ready to attack us with nuclear weapons. So they put their missile force on high alert. They were ready to go to war. There was no love lost. I mean, Russia shot down KAL 007, killing 62 Americans, including an American congressman. Today we have a situation where people talk about Brittany Griner. Well, Brittany Griner is going to jail. Back in the 80s, we were talking about Arthur Nicholson, who was an Army major, shot to death by a Soviet sentry outside of a Soviet tank facility in Ludwigshafen, East Germany, as he was trying to do his job as a military liaison member, monitoring the Soviet group of forces in East Germany. Life and death. So as bad as the situation was in the 80s, we got the INF Treaty, and it helped resolve many of these issues. It set the United States and Soviet Union on a path of normalization of relations, moving away from the crisis-filled confrontation that existed. And so I offer this book up as a template, a lesson of history that's a success, and that it's not that we will be condemned by what happened. If we fail to recognize the lesson of this history, then we'll be condemned by not building on that success, by using it as a template. As bad as things are between the United States and Russia, I believe that arms control could provide the off-ramp, that if we're once again engaged with the Russians in serious fashion about renewing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, about being serious about strategic arms reduction, about maybe renewing the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, renewing the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, getting arms control back as the mainstay of relations between these two nations, we will significantly reduce A, the potential of nuclear conflict, but B, the tension that currently exists. It is counterproductive. Ask anybody in Europe right now, are you benefiting from the current state of affairs between the West and Russia? And the answer is a resounding no. What's going to happen in Europe in this fall and this winter is going to be an unmitigated disaster. Ask the United States, too. Our economies, even though right now we have some things taking place, I think the reason why we're getting the upward ticks are more about artificial intervention by the government than actually a reaction to sustained economic performance. I think when Europe collapses, it'll bring the United States down with it. We need to find a way to get along with Russia, and it doesn't require capitulation. It requires negotiation. And that's why I wrote the book, not only to tell the history of the INF Treaty and its implementation, to provide a template of hope for the present day, that, as bad as things were in the 1980s, we found a way out of it. As bad as things are today, we can likewise find a way out of it by using the template offered by the experience of the INF Treaty.
Do you have a copy of the book that you can maybe hold up to show the audience in case they want to buy it?
There it is, the beautiful cover of the book.
Looks great. Yeah.
It was published by Clarity Press. And so you can go to the Clarity Press website, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, and buy the book there. I think you can get it off of Amazon, Barnes and Nobles.
Great. It sounds like a lot of people should read it and really get that idea. I've heard you talk on other people's shows about during the Reagan administration, there was a brief talks with the Russians to completely get rid of our nuclear arsenals. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Ronald Reagan was president at the time, and when he came in, the Soviet Union was the evil empire. He was surrounded by conservative acolytes who encouraged American military buildup to include our nuclear forces. And under Reagan, we did we brought INF weapon systems to Europe and helped bring about that crisis. Reagan, there was an assassination attempt against Reagan early on in his presidency. And while he was recovering, ABC put on a program called The Day After. It was a TV movie about consequences of nuclear conflict. And Reagan watched it and called people in and said, "Man, is this real? Is this what would happen?" And his advice, it'd be much worse, much worse than this. He said, "Well, this is insanity. Why are we creating the conditions for this?" And then that Able Archer exercise that I talked about prior, when the CIA briefed him on it, he said, "Do the Russians really think we mean them harm, that we want to attack?" And they said, "Yeah, absolutely. The Russians believe that we're out to get them." He said, "Well, this is wrong. We have to find a way to work through." And so Reagan, against the advice of all of his advisors, began the process of reaching out to his Soviet counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev, to begin the normalization of relations. And that would be built on a foundation of disarmament, nuclear disarmament. They met in Reykjavik, Iceland in 1986. And when Reagan sat down with Gorbachev, they were, they're throwing out ideas. And I think Reagan said, "Why don't we just get rid of them all? Forget this 50%, 20%. Why don't we just get rid of them all?" And Gorbachev loved that idea. But the problem is Gorbachev then threw in a caveat. If we do that, then you have to stop strategic defense initiative. And Reagan wasn't willing to do that. Now, later on, Gorbachev's advisors, especially famous Nobel Prize winning scientist named Sakharov, told him, "Man, let them do SDI. It'll never work. It won't work. Just let them spend all their money on SDI. We don't care. Get rid of these nukes. This would be great for the world. We're not losing any strategic advantage because SDI will never work." And when Gorbachev came back, it was too late. Conservatives around Reagan had rallied, whispered in his ear, and he was no longer ready to give up all of America's nuclear weapons. But instead, that opened the door for the INF weapons, getting rid of them, and that created the conditions under which the INF treaty was created, signed, and then implemented.
That's all very interesting. I knew nothing about that. I've always had a relatively low opinion of Ronald Reagan, and I think I still do. But it's very interesting that he considered complete disarmament.
I share. I mean, I'm not sitting here saying that I'm the biggest fan of Ronald Reagan in the world. I was when he was president. I was a young, your age, a conservative, and and today I have the highest respect for Jimmy Carter. But back when Jimmy Carter was president, I had no use for him. I felt he was weak on defense, and so I was a big fan of Ronald Reagan. I spent so much time worried about national security affairs that I paid less attention to things like the economy and domestic problems. And later on, when I learned more about the Reagan presidency, I realized he wasn't as good of a president as I thought he was. But when people ask me to rate the greatest presidents of all time, Ronald Reagan's right at the top. Because you know what? Every president promulgates domestic policy. Most of the policy never gets implemented. It's all talk, talk, talk. There's very little differentiate presidents when it comes to the American economy. Most presidents run roughshod over individual civil liberties. Most presidents do very little to elevate race relations and things of that nature. Only one president had the courage to step up and talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons and then take the step to make it happen. That's Ronald Reagan. And that, to me, has a greater impact on humanity than any of the stupidity of the rest of his policies. Because, again, even though the president is considered to be the most powerful man in the world, that power very rarely translates into actual policy performance. Most of the American domestic policy is dictated by Congress. They pass the laws, they pass the legislation. Presidential intent still has to go through the House of Representatives filter onto the Senate filter, reach a compromise before it gets to his desk. So I don't give the presidents too much credit for what goes on domestically. It's national security and foreign policy that is where I judge them. And when Ronald Reagan came in and talked about the evil empire, and yet in June 1988 was able to go to Moscow, meet with Soviet students in an auditorium and say, "I don't view you as the evil empire anymore. I view you as we can be friends." And he said that in the context of implementation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that got rid of nuclear weapons. Best president ever. Find me another president that did something similar to that. Can't.
Do you think he was Do you think he was being sincere, or do you think he viewed it as if we can get the Russians to get rid of their nuclear weapons, then we can, defeat them conventionally?
No, no, I think this was absolute sincerity on the part of Ronald Reagan. The person that I don't, I mean, I really have a lot of respect for George Herbert Walker Bush in terms of his experience, et cetera. And I give him a lot of credit for managing the collapse of the Soviet Union and managing the collapse of the Warsaw Pact in a way that didn't manifest itself in violence. I mean, it took some skill to do that. But when it comes to nuclear disarmament, I don't respect him as much because he failed to pick up the mantle of leadership that had been given to him by Ronald Reagan. He delayed implementation of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. When George Herbert Walker Bush came into power, and I talk about this in my book, Gorbachev was in the midst of radical reforms known as perestroika, and they were causing significant domestic fallout, especially economically. And Gorbachev really needed to be able to have a strategic arms reduction treaty that would empower him to carry out significant cuts in defense industry and work towards, the conversion of defense industry into more of a consumer-oriented economy. But he couldn't do that without the treaty. And he was begging, pleading George Herbert Walker Bush to get this treaty going. Give me something. Give me a treaty. Give me something. Well, Bush waited until July of 1991, the end of July, to go sign that treaty. There was a coup in mid-August that, pushed Gorbachev out. Now, he came back in, but he never recovered from that coup. The Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991. I'm not going to say that a treaty would have changed things and alter this, but as I talk about in the book, there was a missile built at Vodkinsk called the Courier missile. It's a small ICBM. Had there been a treaty that outright banned small ICBM, then it would have been taken off the table. But because of the cuts made in Soviet missile production by INF, Vodkinsk, the city where this missile factory was where I worked, their economy was suffering, and there's a resonating impact on all of defense industry. The hawks in Russia, defense hawks, needed missile production to continue at high rates. So they not only needed the SS-25 missile, which was being produced there, but they needed the Courier missile to transition from a research and development missile into a full-scale production missile, thereby keeping the money flowing to Vodkinsk. And because the way defense industry works in the Soviet Union, it's a factory town. So if the factory has money, the money flows down, the people get paid their salaries, the schools get funded, everything gets funded. When you starve the factory of missile-based money, then everything else starves and the town suffers. And this happens throughout the Soviet Union. So the Hawks needed this Courier missile. But because George Herbert Walker Bush delayed the implementation of a START treaty, this missile was kept alive longer than it should have been. And in July, August, Gorbachev signed a decree that was going to shut down its missile. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That event, shutting down missile production of the Courier missile at Vodkinsk, is what caused Khrushchev to assemble the special committee that led to the coup. So there's a direct relationship. That's why the part 2 of my book is, the title is Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union, because there's a direct correlation between arms control and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it all centers on Vodkinsk.
Yeah, that's massively interesting. I've always heard that the main reason the Soviet Union fell was I believe Ronald Reagan's son actually said it. It was because they were able to manipulate oil prices with the Saudis. They got the Saudis to ramp up oil production so high that the state-run oil and gas companies in Russia stopped making money, which led to the collapse. But I've never heard this aspect of it. I find it very interesting.
Yeah. The Soviet Union collapsed because of oil. I mean, that's just an oversimplified thing. The Soviet Union collapsed because it stopped functioning as a viable nation state because perestroika never succeeded. Gorbachev did succeed in supplanting the old communist style rule with this new, Soviet style democracy that led to the creation of a people's deputy, Congress of People's Deputies, the empowerment of Boris Yeltsin, the empowerment of the nations instead of. And one of the big things was the Communist Party when it was determined that the Communist Party would no longer be the supreme power. That pretty much gutted the Soviet Union. Now you have various republics starting to run their own affairs. And in Russia, Boris Yeltsin was saying, hey, our money shouldn't go to support the Communist Party and Soviet power. Our money needs to go to support Russia and the new Russian democracy. And if everybody did that, it starved resources of the Soviets as the Soviets lost the ability to govern in centralized fashion. And the end result was chaos and anarchy and the collapse of an economic system. Did low oil prices contribute to this? Absolutely. But I can tell you that if Gorbachev had a functioning economy, he would have been able to adapt to the loss of income from low oil prices.
I wanted to touch on the START treaty. Trump pulled out of the START treaty in his presidency, and I guess my question is, we see what Biden's doing. He's completely incompetent. He seems to want to start World War III. Do you think we'd be better off with Trump in office right now?
I don't know. First of all, the notion. Let me start off by saying this. I always had a mixed opinion of Donald Trump until January 6th. I'm a huge believer of the Constitution. I think what happened on January 6th was a frontal assault against the Constitution. And I'm very critical of Donald Trump for that. I'm not accusing him of a crime, but there's no doubt that whether he was directly involved or this was a matter of people reading into him, he played a role in getting that crowd assembled, getting that crowd moving in a way that disrupted the constitutionally mandated duties and responsibilities of the Congress of the United States in certifying the Electoral College. So, that to me is virtually a disqualifying factor. Now, to mitigate against this, there's not a single president that's ever ruled in modern history that hasn't run roughshod over the Constitution in one way or another. So it seems a little hypocritical to hold Trump accountable for something that that others do continuously. Joe Biden's doing it right now. So there's that. Now, one of the reasons why I liked Trump and I voted for him is that he said we can be friends with Russia. What's wrong with that? I like that idea. That to me is Ronald Reagan-esque. A guy coming out and going against the grain, saying we don't need to be building up our military and getting ready. We need to be friends with these people and learn to peacefully coexist. It's a better world when that happens. The problem is Trump was never able to translate that desire into reality. He was not an effective executive when it came to getting Congress to reinforce his desire. One of the reasons that Congress controlled the Democrats, especially the House, and they were so mad at Trump for winning the election that they sought to impeach him from day one. They were conspiring against his presidency from day one. And so he never really had a chance. But then Trump turned around and he'd say things like, there's been no president stronger than I am when it comes to punishing Russia. No president that's put more sanctions on, which tells me that he's actually a fairly weak president, that he's a weak man, a weak leader. So I don't know how this nation would be functioning under Trump, independent of January 6th. Let's put that aside for a second to talk about foreign policy. And I don't know if things would necessarily change with a Republican Congress, because the Republicans in Congress are just as Russophobic as the Democrats. So we don't know. Now I will say this: if Donald Trump has been saying some things lately that I think make sense. Like maybe we don't need to be in NATO anymore. We don't need to be in NATO. NATO is a poison pill, suicide pact. And I think what's going on today is expose it as a paper tiger that can only exist if the United States is willing to back it to the hilt. But if we want to be friends with Russia, then there's no reason to support continuation of NATO as it's currently configured. I liked that. I would like him to pursue that. And if he comes out and says that Taiwan is part of China, that we're not going to go to war with Taiwan. We're actually going to find a way to peacefully coexist with China and find a way to economically cooperate with China. If he said that, am I be willing to forgive January 6th? Because at the end of the day, he's talking about putting in motion policies that reduce and or eliminate the threat of nuclear conflict. And that saves the world. Mm-hmm. January 6th was an affront to the Constitution, but I believe America is capable of self-healing. But getting, Joe Biden, let's assume that Joe Biden is Mr. Constitution. I believe in the rule of law. I would never violate the rights of any American, but he's embracing policies that could lead to nuclear conflict. It doesn't matter that he's supporting the individual civil liberties of Americans. We're all going to be dead.
Yeah.
So, Trump has the potential of articulating, groundbreaking policies that would disrupt the status quo ante in Washington, D.C. when it comes to national security policies that are putting us down the path of nuclear annihilation. And there's no other politician out there that can do the same thing. So that makes Trump very attractive to a certain group of people. Whether or not enough Americans will, whether or not he'll actually articulate this on the campaign trail, and B, enough Americans will understand the importance of such policies is yet to be seen.
Yeah, I don't think Trump was a particularly good president. I think his murdering of Soleimani was illegal and
yep, I agree.
On a front, but at the same time, I felt far more comfortable with Trump as president. The stuff in North Korea, that was a major achievement, possibly the biggest achievement. Yeah. And that's something, the deep state hated. And that's one reason that I voted for Howie Hawkins, the Green Party candidate in the most recent election. But I would feel much more comfortable with Trump. The deep state doesn't like Trump, and it seems like they're not comfortable doing as much deep state type things with him in office. It seems like if Hillary Clinton would have won in 2016, what we're seeing happening in Ukraine right now might have happened, much sooner. Would you agree
sooner
with that?
And with greater consequences.
For sure.
Look, yeah. Let's go back to one thing you said about Korea. The courage it took for Donald Trump to go down that path can't be understood because nobody supported that. The fact that he got as far along in that process as he did is solely the byproduct of his will, his personal individual will. There was no one in the administration that supported. He was undermined at every step of the way. Mike Pompeo and John Bolton should be arrested as traitors to the nation for how they undermined what Donald Trump was trying to achieve. And take a look at what's happened with Trump out and Biden in. The North Koreans are testing ICBMs. They've put their nuclear weapons right on the front burner. They're saying we're going to use these against you. It's a much more dangerous situation. We have a greater likelihood of nuclear conflict with North Korea today than we did under Donald Trump. So again, big picture, save the world kind of picture. Donald Trump might be the solution or the antidote to the Biden disease. Because I don't think the Democratic Party is capable of nominating anybody who will take us, who will deviate from the current path we're on vis-a-vis foreign policy.
Yeah, and, they had you see Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, and whether you agree with the economic policies of Bernie Sanders, he clearly was far less hawkish, and so was Tulsi Gabbard, and we saw the Democrats do everything in their power to keep them from winning. So I think you're exactly right. The Democrats aren't capable of putting someone up that isn't hawkish. My question now is, how do we make it 2 more years to the 2024 election without letting Biden and his cronies start World War III?
Sadly, I don't think it's up to us anymore. I mean, we've pretty much capitulated across the board on this. I think there are 2 things. One, I think Russia's in control of what's going on in Europe right now. I think Russia has a strategic objective that will ultimately be acceptable to most of Europe. And that is, once they win in Ukraine and they confront Europe with the futility of sanctions and the impotence of NATO, that Europe might be likely to engage in meaningful dialogue about a new European security framework, which is what Russia wanted all along. And I think that's the direction we're heading. And the United States is not going to be a player in this. because the influence of the United States will diminish in relationship to the collapse of the European economy. Whatever emerges from Europe after this looming economic collapse will be governments that are more reflective of the will of their constituents to improve their economic well-being, not to confront Russia. So I think you're going to see Europe doing that which is necessary to survive. So the United States, I think, will have very little control and say over these events. In China, the United States is doing everything possible to precipitate a nuclear conflict with China, even though they claim they're not.
Yeah.
We are. Our policies are responsible. But here, I have to yield to what appears to be the absolute maturity of the Chinese government. They know what they want to accomplish in Taiwan. They also know what the consequences of military conflict are. And I think that they're not going to take the bait. They know what happens if they sink the American fleet. So I think the Chinese are going to do everything possible not to be in a position to have to sink the American fleet. And so there's a lot of people that are, saying that the Chinese are bluffing. They're this. I don't think the Chinese bluff. I just think the Chinese play the long game, and that the Chinese are not going to do anything that undermines the investment they made in the past decade plus on building this immense global economic empire. I think they want to continue to build that empire, consolidate that empire, and an invasion of Taiwan would be disruptive to this goal and objective. So I think the Chinese are going to be far more mature than what I mean. I still believe the United States is capable of provoking China into an invasion because we think the Chinese are bluffing. And while I can't tell you what exactly would trigger a Chinese invasion, the Chinese have said that any effort by the Taiwanese government to declare independence or any actions on the part of the international community to recognize Taiwan as independent would require a non-peaceful response, i.e. an invasion. At some point in time, Taiwan and the West may stumble into a war by not believing China would respond and by inadvertently crossing a red line. But I do believe that China is playing the long game and that they understand that history and time is on their side. And rather than succumb to the short-term visceral desire to invade Taiwan because of an affront given by Pelosi to the American fleet, I think the Chinese, may very well just take a wait-and-see posture. And that way we're saved because there won't be a nuclear conflict. Now, can the Chinese ride this out for 2 years until Biden's gone? I don't know. I do believe that the Russians will have a European security framework worked out before Biden leaves office. So, and again, that just shows you how pathetically impotent America has become in Europe today.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to touch on is, Latvia the other day and some other European countries are calling Russia state sponsors of terror, and we're seeing flare-ups in Serbia with Serbia and Kosovo. And once again, you see Kaliningrad being cut off from rail transit. It seems like the EU and NATO, they're trying to overextend. They're trying to overextend the Russians as much as they can. Would you agree with that? They're trying to get Russia to take military action somewhere else other than just Ukraine.
I don't know if I would say that that's a unified policy position on the part of all of Europe. What I would say is that there's parties within the European, family of nations who are doing just that for that very reason. That the best way to save Ukraine right now would be to create a situation where Russia had to divert military resources to deal with another crisis. I think, and it's just grossly irresponsible because that's based upon a premise that Russia has, as according to British intelligence and American intelligence, that Russia has committed 60 to 80% of its military force to Ukraine. The reality is Russia has committed 15 to 20%. That there's still 85 to 80% of its military force left, which means they have more than enough force to deal with other crises as they emerge. And Russia hasn't mobilized. What NATO doesn't understand is that if they continue to provoke confrontations, such as in Lithuania, etc., whereas the Russian people might oppose general mobilization for Ukraine, they will not oppose general mobilization to defend Kaliningrad. And general mobilization will radically change the ground truth realities in Europe when it comes to military confrontation. So I agree with you that there are certain elements within Europe that are seeking to promote confrontations designed to diminish Russian military power in Ukraine. But I also believe that Russia is in control of the situation, and that Russia isn't, like China, isn't going to lose sight of their strategic objective, that rather than to gain short-term advantage in a secondary crisis, I think they want to keep their eye on the ball and resolve the Ukrainian conflict first.
Yeah, you even have Baltic countries now talking about cutting Russia off from the Baltic Sea. How could they even possibly enforce that?
That will never happen.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. I have. There's people in Albany who take hallucinogenic drugs and go out on the street corner and say amazing things. I don't give them any credence because it's so far detached from reality as to be absurd. And when Finland is in talks with Latvia over shutting down the Baltic Sea from Russia, that's the equivalent of some drug-addled idiot standing on the street corner spewing nonsense. It's stupidity in the extreme.
And also it fundamentally violates, the West statements on, international waters and the free transit of the seas. I mean,
but Russia's not. But what I don't understand is, why do they think that Russia is, a third grader that could be so easily bullied in the school playground?
It's almost like they live. I've made this comparison before. It seems like leaders in America and in the West, they have this idea that they're living in 1960s America or like 1970s America, where America has all this influence over the world, and it's just completely delusional. They don't have that anymore. There's the Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, what's curious about that, though, is go back and study the history of Berlin. Take a look at John F. Kennedy and the reason why he had to run to Khrushchev and have the initial summit with him I believe, in Vienna. It's because Russia could impose its will on Berlin at any time. We had no response. So the notion that America was all powerful and flexible, we weren't. We were very weak. Then we got tied down in Vietnam. We couldn't respond to the 1968 Soviet incursion into Prague. We couldn't respond to the Soviets invading Hungary in the 1950s. So this America has never been as omnipresent and strong as people like to believe. The Soviets / Russians have always been a significant power that we have, that we were compelled to respect until the 1990s, and then we had the decade of Boris Yeltsin, and we saw the absolute degradation of Soviet power, Soviet economy, and the Russian people.
Yeah.
But Putin has rebuilt all this. And but somehow we're trapped not in the 60s, we're trapped in the 90s. And we believe that Russia is weak and that Russia is beholden to us, that the American economy is supreme. Russia is not weak, Russia is not beholden to us. And I think Russia has proved that its economy is far more resilient to economic sanctions than the European economy is.
Well, they've been able to spend close to 2 decades now preparing for that, right? They knew what would come from the West.
They had the plan. Yeah.
Like you said, American leaders, they loved Russia in the 90s when Russia was poor and starving and people were addicted to drugs and there was human trafficking. They loved Russia then, right? Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton were best buddies in the White House, So they don't hate Russia necessarily. They just hate an independent Russia,
They're resentful of an independent Russia. And you see this in the person of Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, headed up the so-called Russian reset that defined Obama presidency's policy posture towards Russia. It's really regime change policy targeting Vladimir Putin to remove him from power. Listen to what he's saying today. This is a man totally detached from reality. He's supposed to be a U.S. ambassador to Russia, but he's shown an absolute disregard for the people of Russia. He's advocating, for instance, banning all the issuance of visas to all Russian people. I mean, it's just absurd in the extreme. But that's the mindset that exists in the United States and among American politicians about Russia today. A total disregard for the humanity, for the reality of Russia.
Yeah, I've seen people make the point that this is the first time we've seen a cancel culture go so far as to cancel an entire country's history and all of that. I wanted to touch on China's president Xi is expected to visit Saudi Arabia in the next week, and the top topic people expect us to be payment for Saudi oil in yuan, and that would obviously be very destructive to the petrodollar and American influence, and it would only drive up inflation. Do you have any other comments on that?
Well, I mean, we're looking at a major geopolitical realignment in the world today, away from an American-centric world to a world that's multipolar. But some poles are going to be more equal than others. China is a member of BRICS, the Economic Forum: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's actually now includes Argentina and Iran. But
Saudi Arabia is actually
they're applying. Well, this is the point I was going to make. Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia are applying to join. A key aspect of the last BRICS meeting was the notion of creating a so-called currency basket that would serve as an alternative to global reserve currencies that are currently dominated by the dollar and the euro. And one of the things that makes a currency basket viable is the ability of national currencies to be traded, to be involved in trade, and to create a framework for the conversion of currencies that makes it economically feasible. And I believe that the Saudi visit or the Chinese visit to Saudi Arabia will in fact be centered on not only improving relations, increasing trade, increasing the Chinese procurement of Saudi oil, but also that this will be paid for in Chinese currency. And as you indicated, this will be a major blow to the dollar. Right now, look, America is just literally one of the most irresponsible, arrogant nations in the world. There are people today who believe that the U.S. dollar is impervious to this kind of action because no other currency provides the long-term investment stability, especially in the oil markets, that the dollar brings. You see, if you want to invest $40 billion in producing an oil field that isn't going to pay off for 30 years, you need to make sure you don't lose your investment in a currency collapse, that the dollar provides a guarantee of stability, long-term stability. That may have been true in the past. It's no longer true today because what the key to stability is global confidence in the dollar. And I think people have lost confidence in the dollar because the dollar is not just about paying off debt. The dollar has become a trap. Look at Russia. Their sovereign wealth fund was $650 billion in euros. The United States just went out and stole it. And then we tried to punish Russia by cutting them off from international banking systems that are beholden to the dollar, meaning that if a dollar touches the transaction, the United States can shut it down. This has made the dollar toxic. The dollar is now toxic. It's a toxic currency, and the world's going to run away from that toxicity. They're tired of being sanctioned irresponsibly. They're tired of the United States violating the law because of the strength of the dollar, and the world is ready for alternative global financial arrangements.
Yeah, and especially the global South, which has been held back so long in their development. They see the United States as the people holding them back. Meanwhile, you have countries like China and even Russia, but especially China, their Belt and Road Initiative, going and building infrastructure in these third world countries. And a lot of people will say, "Oh, yeah, but that's just China." China is going to give them a loan that they can never pay back. And, we'll see if that's true. I don't think it is. But, even if it is, that's far better for those countries than working with the United States. Would you not agree?
Has anybody taken a look at an International Monetary Fund,
Exactly.
bailout package and the demands that they put on that? People talked about Sri Lanka. Of course, we had the recent economic collapse in Sri Lanka and the storming of the parliament and the presidential palace by an enraged population. And one of the thematics that's going on in the West is this is because of the Chinese debt trap. There is no Chinese debt trap. The only debt trap is the IMF debt trap, the World Bank debt trap, the American debt trap. We create debt traps. China encourages infrastructure development. I mean, they've spent $7 to $10 trillion, hello kitten, in the over the course of the last decade and a half. Building relationships with the world and building infrastructure, making the developing countries stronger with greater economic potential. What has the United States done? Nothing by comparison. What we have encouraged is nations buying into International Monetary Fund debt relief packages that destroy their economy and make them totally beholden to the American and the economies of the G7. The world's tired of this game. They're literally fed up with it. And in the United States, you hear the talk. Government only governs so long as it has the consent of the governed. It can only govern with the consent of the governed. The dollar can only reign as the global supreme currency with the consent of the people that use the dollar. If enough people say we're done with the dollar, then the dollar has no value. And I think we've reached that point, where the tipping point, where the developing world, the BRICS nations, are just fed up with the dollar, and they're just building a world that is dollar free.
How will that affect? How do you believe that'll affect the domestic U.S. economy?
I think we'll see hyperinflation. I mean, what happens when because we've printed all this money that's out there for the dollar, for oil, for energy, and what happens when the dollar becomes valueless? Basically, you're going to see hyperinflation, and it could lead to economic collapse, a depression. So that's the risk. I think we'd be looking at a collapse of the stock market. I think we'd be looking at the collapse of foreign investments in the United States. We'd be looking at hyperinflation, the collapse of the dollar, basically, would just become valueless. And I think that's inevitable. Now, maybe there's some things that can be done policy-wise to lessen the impact of this collapse. But at the end of the day, the dollar is never going to regain its stature in the world. The policies of the United States, of successive presidential administrations, have guaranteed that outcome. The world has lost faith in the dollar, lost faith in America. And we're never going to recover from that.
What are some of those policies you think that could, soften the blow of the dollar collapsing?
Well, the most important thing would be to anticipate the collapse, to anticipate what's about to happen. Most of the time, if you take a look at investors, they seek to mitigate downturns in the market by, first of all, they accept, they will accept a small loss in order to forestall a major loss. So there's things the United States could do to start withdrawing from markets that the dollar might not be as strong as it is, therefore to lessen the pressure on the dollar. And I think one of the key things is to restore trust and confidence in the dollar. Now, this is going to be very difficult for an executive branch to do, because most of the sanctions that are passed in the world today are passed by Congress. But I think if the president had a strategic meeting with the big eight in Congress, and told them that we're facing the global collapse of the U.S. dollar if we don't change policies, and basically to stop sanctioning people, to eliminate all secondary sanctions, to say that just because the dollar touches something is no longer, American law doesn't automatically jump in, to basically conform American law with international law. So the United States isn't seen as a rogue power. And there might be some nations who are so vested in the dollar that they won't be willing to take the economic loss that would happen if they tried to shift over to the BRICS basket of currencies. People will make that loss if they believe that the dollar is going to collapse. And if you can restore faith in the dollar, and the key element of restoring faith in the dollar is to ensure people that the United States is not going to steal your money. The United States is not going to sanction you, et cetera. That if you use the dollar in an economic transaction, you're safe. I think that would go a long way in restoring faith in the dollar. But again, that would require Congress to pretty much admit that sanctions are a self-destructive policy, and Congress isn't willing to do that.
Yeah, it's we're definitely facing tough times, and that's so unfortunate because it's really all unnecessary. I wanted to touch on we kind of touched on it already, but the U.S., the Navy, saying that they plan in the coming days to send a fleet through the Taiwan Strait. Do you believe them?
I believe them.
Yeah.
We've done it before. It's part of freedom of navigation exercises, and just an overall posture that the United States Navy should be allowed to sail anywhere it wants to, anytime it wants to. I don't think the Chinese will sink them. The Navy clearly is concerned about this because they're not letting the aircraft carrier join the ships. It's just a smaller group of ships. But what I do think could happen is when that fleet finishes its provocation, that China will say that the United States has proved that they don't respect Chinese sovereignty, that it encourages Taiwanese independence. And China may invade Taiwan.
That's not good, is it? What is the... Do you think the U.S. responds, if that happens?
To an invasion?
Yeah.
I think the military will tell the president straight up, there's nothing we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I say that is let's go back in history. If you remember when the global hawk was shot down by Iran, Hormuz,
yeah,
Donald Trump wanted to retaliate. He wanted to go in and bomb different sites in Iran, and the military told him that if we do this, there will be an Iranian retaliation of the scope and scale of which will dramatically alter the international economy and the balance of power in the world, because Iran will take out all of the oil facilities in the Middle East, all of them, and then they'll strike us, and there's nothing we can do conventionally for about 9 months, because that's what's going to take to build up forces. So we're setting in motion things that we can't control, and there's going to be a long-term detrimental impact. We strongly advise against carrying this out, and Trump went along with it. There was no retaliation strike. I believe the military is fully capable of telling Joe Biden that in the case of an invasion of Taiwan, there's literally nothing we can do militarily, and that to try to force the issue would lead to the potential of conflict that could quickly spiral out of control. Whether or not the president's willing to listen to that is another question altogether. But I think he does have some cover in this, because he can say, I didn't start this. Nancy Pelosi started this. Yes. She traveled there even though we didn't want her to travel. So who knows what's going to happen? This administration is the only consistency in this administration is how weak they are, and weak people always tend to overreact because they believe that somehow shows them to be strong.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. A strong America would avoid a conflict with China, especially over the issue of Taiwan.
You talk about how they could blame it on Nancy Pelosi starting it. When her plane was in the air and approaching Taiwan, the White House released a statement saying, they don't condone the visit. They don't take any responsibility. That's as Chinese fighter planes are crossing the Taiwan Strait. And then, about an hour later, when she landed and the Chinese didn't launch any strikes, then all of a sudden the White House is saying, oh, we won't be intimidated. We won't back down. Right. So I think you're completely right. They'll try to blame it on Pelosi. An article was just posted on RT saying that there's a possible time for Biden and Xi face-to-face meeting sometime in November. It says officials in Beijing are making preparations for a face-to-face meeting with Chinese leaders Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden in Southeast Asia in November. Do you think the chances of that are possible? Do you think they're high, or?
Well, I think they're high because it's a necessary meeting.
Yes.
I think it's a meeting that has to take place, and hopefully Biden will get the right signal. The problem is Biden right now seems to only have, one option in his playbook, and that's called American posturing in an intimidating fashion. Remember, he met Putin in June of 2021, and he allegedly stared Putin in the eyes and called him an evil murderer, and said, "We will respond with massive sanctions." And look where it got us. I'm concerned that he would try to pull the same stunt against the Chinese, and it'll get him nowhere.
I mean, if you think, I mean, we're seeing the fallout of these sanctions against Russia. If the U.S. and the West were to do the same to China, it would, I mean, China makes everything, right? China makes everything for us. So
we
I
haven't
mean,
thought it through. I mean, there's people out there saying that we would win, but then when I take a look at the data that they base their assumptions on, I don't see any. Meaning that these are assumptions that are driven from a gut feel as opposed to a studious examination of available data. The Chinese economy, isn't perfect. It has some weaknesses, has some flaws, and there's no doubt that China would pay a price. But China hasn't spent the last decade plus building up global supply chains just to fold like a house of cards at the first sign of difficult weather. China is a very smart nation. I believe that, like Russia, they will not enact any policies or undertake any actions unless they fully thought out the potential consequences and they're prepared to accept those consequences and deal with those consequences. So, I think we would find that the American economy would collapse rapidly, and the Chinese economy there might be some restriction and some gradual, but the Chinese will recover and rapidly expand because they have the potential to, because of the networks that they've built, the Belts and Roads Initiative.
don't you think that American corporations, Wall Street, don't you think they would be against an all-out conflict with China or any type of large-scale sanctions? Because I mean, I just said it. Everything's made in China. Everything these companies make is made in China or somewhere in Southeast Asia. American oil companies sell a lot of oil to China. China buys a massive amount of food from the United States. Do you think the corporations would be, if we're being honest, corporations around the United States, right? So would they be on board for these sanctions, you think, against China?
I don't think we should give these corporations too much credit for being the best geopolitical analysts in the world. Their assessments tend to be geared towards energy markets. Now energy markets will respond, and when you deal with non-energy aspects, I think their analysis tends to suffer. And the reason why I bring that up is they may be susceptible to the spin being put out by the White House about China's bluffing, China's economy is weaker than you think, et cetera, and they might buy into that, and therefore not be willing to put the kind of pressure on Biden administration to avoid a war that could happen if they definitely believe that their industries would suffer egregiously because of any conflict with China. So I wish big business was more attuned to the reality of the world today, and I wish that they would, once so attuned, would use the various levers of influence to get policy change in the Biden administration. But I just don't have confidence that they're as good as in global analysis as many people think they are.
Yeah, it's crazy to me, the amount of delusion that so many, people that are supposed to be the highest educated people in the U.S., right? People that go to Harvard, go to Yale, right? These people are supposed to be the best of the best, and yet they live in this fantasy world, right? Where China is supposedly weak and they rely on the United States, and it's clearly the other way around. We've kind of run out of questions I had. The one last thing I had was Moscow recently talked about the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and they're hopeful to maybe resurrect that. Do you see any chance of that happening in the near future?
I mean, there's always a chance. I think everybody's leaning in that direction. The question right now is, what compromises is Iran willing to make? Iran's taken a very hardline stance, made some very specific demands about, requirements regarding American behavior. in relationship to sanctions and things of that nature. Is Iran willing to accept a compromise to get the JCPOA back up and running, knowing that the Biden administration has no long-term intent of complying with this agreement? I mean, this is just a statement of fact. Biden inherited a position taken by Obama that basically said, as we approach the time for the lifting of these sunset clauses that bring restrictions to Iran, we will have to re-examine where we are and what our next steps would be. Why next steps? You've entered an agreement where the next step is to do nothing and just let the agreement run its course. So clearly the United States has been saying all along that it will never allow Iran to possess a large-scale, meaningful uranium enrichment capability that is based upon advanced centrifuge designs, capable of enriching uranium at a very high rate, and as Iran is proving today, to the potential for 90% production, which is fissile, could be used in a weapon. I'm not saying Iran's pursuing a weapon. I'm just saying that I don't see the Biden administration allowing any agreement with Iran to reach maturity. I think that they're just buying time. There's an absolute requirement right now to get Iranian oil back on the market so that prices are stable. They view that getting Iranian oil on the market would be a competition against Russia, thereby lowering the price of oil so Russia makes less money. The Iranians see through this. They know that the United States is an unreliable partner, and they know that whatever agreement is that might be signed today or tomorrow won't be worth the paper it's written on if at any time Congress or the president decides that they no longer support that policy. So I'd have to see all of the compromises that Iran's being called upon to make when it comes to their very strong position against restarting the JCPOA with any modifications other than original intent under the agreement.
Well, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, always, they always found that Iran was following through with their obligations of the JCPOA. But one thing that's clear is if you're a country that the United States doesn't like, if you want to guarantee your sovereignty from the U.S., then nuclear weapons are the way to go, right? North Korea kind of proved that.
Well, I mean, North Korea makes a solid case for that. I would say that that this doesn't apply to Iran. There's two reasons why. One, they don't need a nuclear deterrent. They have the oil deterrent. The key about a nuclear weapon is that the reason why you have it is the notion of mutually assured destruction, that nobody believes you're going to win a nuclear war. So you have a nuclear weapon to make sure that people understand that if they engage you, it's going to go nuclear, everybody loses. Well, Iran has the equivalent of that in terms of its ability to destroy the regional oil producing infrastructure. They can bring down the world, bring down the region, bring down everybody just by blowing up the oil. So they don't need a nuclear weapon. Actually seeking to acquire a nuclear weapon would be devastating, might even be the end of the theocracy as we know it, because it is a theocracy. When you have a supreme leader issue a fatwa or a religious edict banning weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, and then allows a nuclear weapon to be built, it means that he's a liar, that his fatwas carry no weight, that he's not a good marja or a good religious leader. And this could lead to a lack of confidence on the part of the Iranian people with the supreme leader and the theocracy. So again, I don't see a situation where Iran is going to deviate from the religious edicts or fatwas that have been issued by both Khomeini and Ali Khamenei. I don't see that.
You don't think they feel they need to get in on mutually assured destruction with the Israelis having nuclear weapons?
No, I don't think they feel that at all. I think they recognize that more harm will befall them by pursuing nuclear weapons than good.
That's very interesting. I wanted to touch on Israel real quick. Obviously, Israel once again last week started carrying out a bombing campaign of Gaza again. Um, the timing of everything right now. Anytime anything happens now, it makes me think: is this the U.S. trying to provoke another conflict somewhere? Create more instability. Do you think that's what's going on, or do you think this Israeli bombing campaign in Gaza had nothing to do with geopolitics?
I mean, everything has something to do with geopolitics in that region, but
Sure.
I don't think the United States was behind this attack. I don't think the United States was knowledgeable of this attack. I think this attack was an attack of opportunity, where they took out a very senior member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
But he was in a civilian apartment building, right?
They don't care.
Well, sure, but the world should, and many
The
people
world doesn't
do.
care. World doesn't care. How much hue and cry is there? None. And take a look. Hamas doesn't care. They didn't get involved. Hezbollah doesn't care. They didn't get involved. Nobody cares. Basically, Israel was allowed to carry out a targeted assassination of senior Palestinian Islamic Jihad officials, and now they're seeking to end this conflict. So I think it was a target of opportunity. The Israelis took it. I think they communicated to everybody that we're not coming after you. Stay out of this fight, and everybody did. So, it is what it is.
Yeah. One more thing I wanted to touch on is Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, but specifically 1, it hasn't been in operation because the turbine that they need to operate it was unable to be transferred from Canada back to, I believe, Russia because of the sanctions. As winter comes and you're forecasting it, and everybody else that has a brain is forecasting, a very bad winter in Europe ahead. And, once they get to that, 5,000 euro energy payments, do you believe that they maybe change their tune and they maybe make up with Russia and switch on Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2?
Desperate people do desperate things, and Europe's going to be in desperate times. I don't think anything should be discounted.
Yeah. What would the U.S. response to that happening be? Because they've sanctioned much of Nord Stream 2 and everybody involved with it.
I don't think anybody cares about what the U.S. reaction will be at that point in time. There's an old saying or a notion that any nation can collapse if its population misses 9 meals. You are 9 meals away from total chaos and anarchy. 9 missed meals. Europe's about to get into a situation where the 9 missed meals factor comes into play. When that happens, neither the people of Europe nor the governments that are in place will really give any. They won't care about what the United States thinks because they're fighting for their survival. And indeed, politically, many of them will blame the United States for their problems because of past leaderships blindly following and buying into, American-inspired policies.
Yeah, they'll be completely correct. I mean, what Europe's going to go through is largely the fault of the United States. I mean, it's the fault of the European leaders, but the European leaders are following the U.S. Correct. So they'll be completely correct in that. This has been a great talk. That's all I have. It's very, very challenging times we're in. Hopefully we can avoid large-scale conflict. What you're talking about in your book, it's all very important. Everybody should go check out his book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. Do you have anything else you want to add before we go?
No, I just want to commend you for your preparation, your good questions, and it was a pleasure.
It's a pleasure with you as well. I hope to talk to you again in the future.
Okay, look forward to it.
Have a good day.
You too.